Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the FoodBiz Plus. For today, we're focusing on sustainable supply chains. We're getting started right now, and I just wanted to go through a few introductory slides. Hopefully, you're seeing the slideshow. First of all, this FoodBiz Plus is sponsored by the Food Business School. I am Andy Shaka, and I'm the lead for curriculum and program design. This FoodBiz Plus series features monthly conversations with food industry innovators, and we work to explore the latest opportunities as well as identify some of the biggest threats in the food business. Today we're focused on sustainability, and our guest will be Helene York, and a little bit more about her in a moment. But if you haven't heard of the Food Business School before, it is the new Center for Executive and Graduate Education of the Culinary Institute of America. Our mission is to enable and empower our students to design, deliver, and lead transformative innovations that address the world's most pressing food systems challenges and address its greatest business opportunities. So I'd like to invite Helene to share her camera today if she could. Helene York is our special guest, as I mentioned. She's the Global Director of Responsible Business for Compass Group at Google. How are you today, Helene?
I'm well. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thanks so much for being here. So I'm going to jump our conversation off today with something that might be interest. Oops, it looks like we've got a bit of feedback coming from someone's camera. Let's see here. Let me see if I can request that. Lee, if you're able to hear me, if you could mute your camera, that would be helpful. Getting just a little bit of feedback. But I'll just go ahead with the conversation, Helene. So you've taught this course, or a variation of this course, twice before for our online program. And now we're offering it as an in-person innovation intensive. I was wondering if you could tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about sort of where that conversation started for you and where that decision came from and why we're offering this as an in-person intensive this time around.
Sure. I really enjoyed teaching the online seminars. There was really interesting engagement and some great work products, and I think most participants really got something out of it. But I will admit that I got maybe a little less out of it than I would have liked, and I think that others got less out of it than we could have if we had folks all in the same room and really talking through some of their issues in real time with everybody there. There's just a qualitative difference, and if you indulge me, I think I can learn to be a better teacher and communicator of the kinds of challenges in developing sustainable supply chains and in thinking through the values that you need to think through in order to make decisions in the real world. So that's my hope. I think that we can create a unique learning environment in person, and there will be more people to support all of the learners in the classroom, including me.
Great. Now, I didn't mean to skip over this, but if you could talk a little bit about your background and your role for Compass Group at Google, I think that would help our viewers understand a little bit more about sort of your orientation to this class.
Yeah, like, what do I know about this subject? I've spent 12 years in supply chains. I started in sustainable seafood on a US basis, and then I moved to global. And it was really about being the translator between the scientists on the one hand and the chefs on the other, and then the procurement departments, and trying to make it a valuable to have everybody understand the same basic concepts and to move chefs in the direction of being able to buy more responsible species. We have tremendous global issues with seafood, as we do with a lot of other parts of our food supply chains. So doing that for a few years, I moved through the ranks at Bon Appetit Management Company, ended up being their director of procurement strategy, and really looked through what it means to buy meat in a more responsible way. What does it mean to develop relationships with local farmers, with local artisans of different varieties? How do you balance the higher costs of working with some producers who may be a little further along in their understanding of supply chain improvements that are needed, and those who are open to learning, suppliers who are open to learning, and really building relationships with them so that they can make improvements on a much larger scale. So did that. Then I moved over to Compass Group, which is the parent of Bon Appetit, working exclusively with Google. And Google operates cafes for their employees in many, many, many countries. The company that I work for, we operate cafes, restaurants, catering operations in 27 of those countries. And so I've worked with procurement directors in all of those countries on every continent. And I find that there is a remarkable commonality of basic understanding of these issues and a wide disparity of government regulations that will bring certain issues up to the forefront, will give us better quality information about what's available because suppliers have to conform to those regulations. Chefs have similar understandings, but different understandings. And so, sustainable food system fundamentally is about making change globally. Do we have to make change globally? Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. But if we don't really work on some of the great challenges globally, then we won't have a sustainable food system. So the commonalities and the differences are fascinating, and I hope to be able to convey some of those examples in this intensive.
Great. So obviously the issues that you are bringing up are important to anyone who's interested in the food system and in our future. And the challenges that we have, of course, to feed a rising population with more and more limited resources. What is the ideal sort of background or interest level of a student for this course? Who would benefit most from the course, and sort of what are you looking for in terms of the cohorts?
Sure. I think people can come from a wide variety of backgrounds. Corporate chefs are one group that I would really love to talk to because they hear from magazines, books, other chefs who don't really have the depth of experience in working through supply chain changes. They may be familiar with some local farmers, and that's great, but that's only part of the perspective, or local fishermen, for instance. Anyone who is involved in working through procurement specifications, or buying products, whether you're in a retail environment, in let's say a supermarket chain, or if a restaurant chain, or food service. I think there are a variety of different kinds of experiences of people who both have primary responsibility for making procurement decisions, or those who interact with those who do, and who really want to have a better set of questions to ask the procurement professionals. Why are you making this choice? Have you considered these values? This is a lovely product, but does it, do we know that there's no slavery in the supply chain, or that the suppliers are making a commitment to look into those issues itself? So, those who really have almost anything to do with food on an institutional level might have get some real benefit out of this class. I'd certainly be happy to answer a question of any prospective student, learner, as to if someone gives me their background and if they think the class will be worth it. I'm very happy to do that, because a variety certainly makes sense, but some people are just really enthusiastic about this work, and if they're looking for the future or for a future job, they might benefit from it as well.
Great, thank you. So let's assume that I'm a supply chain manager. What are some of the most dynamic issues that are facing our food system today and that I should be prepared to address in order to be successful in my position as I move forward?
I think one of the biggest things that's changed over the last dozen years that I have been working on supply chain improvements, creating supply chains, is that change is happening at a faster rate. It's happening at a faster rate for many reasons. There are many more non-governmental organizations who are putting pressure on major organizations that buy food. There are governments that have gotten involved and have changed regulations. There are suppliers who are gauging an interest and making improvements. I will admit, guilty, I am a geek. I read World Poultry and industry magazine. I don't even eat chicken, but it's a very important magazine, and it's quite clear from that and the pork councils and even beef councils and certainly Beyond Meat, where, and I'm not talking about the name of the company, I'm talking about other categories of food, that, you know, suppliers are listening. Suppliers, however, don't necessarily know which way to go because there are a lot of conflicting messages. You know, GMOs, are they good or bad? There are two different efforts happening at the same time with completely opposing points of view. So how do you, as a producer of food, react to that? And I think that the most important thing for a supply chain manager is to know the questions to ask the suppliers and know the questions to raise points within their own organizations to get clarity on what it is we're trying to achieve. We cannot do these things overnight. We cannot do them, even though Walmart, largest buyer of food on the planet, has been very disruptive in many ways, but can't change everything. And Walmart's values may not be the same as a small restaurant company. Certainly they have access to a lot of different materials. So the point of this course in a lot of ways is to think about what are the things that are changing in the food system and what are the things we want to change, and to think about goals over a 5-10 year point of view. I have to bring up climate change. I mean, we have seen let's just use the United States as an example. We have seen two major hurricanes that have disrupted supplies coming into ports, including fuel to transport goods, including food, that will destroy a lot of the crops that are very important because both South Texas and Florida are major growing areas for not only the rest of the United States, but frankly at this time of the year for a lot of South America as well. We've seen, you know, dozens and dozens of forest fires on the west of the United States. And as we know, no one storm or no one fire is a result of climate change. But the patterns are quite clear that storms and fires are intensifying, pressures on fresh water supplies are intensifying, and that is going to have a real effect on our ability to grow food, to raise animals or fish, and what is our supply chain in the future? And if we set our standards to be very, very narrow, let me give you one example. Some companies are really, really committed to certified organic products. When you have greater weather variability, that is, first of all, it's very hard to be an organic farmer. And my hat is off to them. I'm not even wearing my hat because it is so hard to do that work with integrity. And many farmers do. But, you know, climate variability makes it even tougher. And that is not the only way to have responsible and nourishing food. And so someone who wants to be a supply chain manager or a chief procurement officer might want to think broadly about what are the values we want in responsible plant foods, and then how to achieve that. And it may be beyond having such narrow categories in various certifications that I would have favored 10 years ago.
That makes sense. I think your answer also provided a lot of the challenges. I think I was going to ask about that. What are some of the greatest challenges facing the food system? And you've covered quite a few in your most recent answer to the question that I had. But now I'm wondering, are there signs of hope? I mean, it's not that what you're saying sounds dismal or anything, but what are some of the more hopeful signs about what we're seeing in the food system?
I get asked a lot, are you pessimistic or are you hopeful? And my answer is both. But I will point to some hopeful signs. There are many, many more people who are actively engaged in thinking about these questions. And you can't work in a procurement department of a food company anymore without thinking about these issues. Certainly not in the United States. I will tell you that even my experience working with colleagues in Latin America and in several countries in Asia, the definitions might be a little less well developed than in Europe and the United States because there hasn't been as much conversation. But the fact that Japan is now talking about sustainable seafood is remarkable. The fact that China has a number of efforts underway to think about sustainable seafood, because between Japan and China, that's almost 80% of the world's consumption of seafood. It's really important. I mean, Americans sometimes, I'm guilty of this too. I mean, Americans sometimes have the hubris to think that we can solve the sustainable seafood problem, and we can't. We don't eat enough seafood for that to matter. We can help define the tools. We can help share experiences with our colleagues in other countries, whether they work for non-governmental organizations or private companies or just in sort of citizen conferences about what things work. And chefs can certainly do this, talking about how to make responsible food more delicious and mimic foods that are need to take less active a role in a sustainable food system. Let me move away from seafood for a while and talk about meat. You know, the United States has seen a very significant drop in beef consumption. It's a short-term result, but if it continues, that is enormously successful. And there are some really tremendous people who are raising beef, and I don't want to put the blame on beef producers for everything. It's just not fair, but they need to be a part of the solution, and especially in effluent management, and potentially using their manure in a much more responsible way. Working with local crop farmers as an agent to renew the soils. But there are so many more actors who are interested in helping define what a sustainable food system is. And there's a lot of noise right now, and there's a lot of folks who are probably moving on paths that are less central to the core issues of sustainability. But I am very encouraged by the fact that we have many more people involved in the conversation trying to do things. That's ultimately, that's what you need.
That's great. I am picking up on something that I remember we talked about once when we were developing your online course, and that is that a product can be perfectly sustainable, but if it isn't delicious, it's not going to come off the shelves, right? It can do everything right. So I'm glad that you suggested that corporate chefs take an interest in this course and people who are actually handling food directly. I know some of the folks who might consider enrolling in this in-person intensive are also considering attending Rethink, focused on food and technology. So could you speak a little bit about the connection that you see between the audience for your course and the folks who might be coming for the Rethink Food Conference?
Well, I have to also put in a plug for Rethink because it's one of the most fun conferences that I've ever been to. It's still a relatively new annual
Definitely.
conference, but it's an opportunity to think big and think out of the box and imagine ideas that aren't being tried right now or tried on small scale. And I remember 2 years ago attending and getting ideas about the future. It's a very hopeful conference, and it really shows the power of, larger companies can be part of the solution, and small companies can also be part of the solution. And I think that's my bias, I will tell you. I mean, I have worked for larger companies. Before I got into food, I worked for smaller companies, but we all have to participate. And I think if those who think that it's only a small or new company game are missing 98% of the food system, and we can't achieve a sustainable food system without participation of many different partners. So I would love to meet people in advance at Rethink and then continue the conversation the following week.
Oh, that's great. I'm going to return to the topic of GMOs, and I know that this came up often in the online course, and you've already touched on it. It's the kind of topic that tends to inspire very hard-line positions amongst people who, it's either all good or all bad. One of the questions, though, that came in from one of our participants on this topic is if you could sort of describe your vision for how the GMO, non-GMO argument might disrupt the current supply chain and what we need to be aware of as we approach the issue with respect to sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the GMO campaigns in the United States, keep in mind this is really not going on anywhere else. There was a conversation in Europe about this more than a decade ago, and it's just not an active conversation anymore. It's really about integrity, right? It's not. There are a lot of people who are anti-GMO because they feel that we have moved away from integrity in the food system, and I think that the campaigns are a bit misdirected per se, but I would love to see and then the reason I think they're misdirected is that I don't see this being a really big part of the food system. I saw an advertisement last week for GMO-free water. There are no GMOs in water. There's no gluten-free water either. But we now have such a surfeit of certifications, which, by the way, cost money to producers. And they are effectively misleading consumers. Olive oil, GMO-free, gluten-free. I kid you not. I have seen this just last week. And there is no gluten in olive oil. There's no GMO in olive oil. And the more we see these labels, the more consumers think this is a big deal. But fundamentally right now, GMOs exist for animal feed. And so it's not something we're eating on a primary basis. And it exists in the rennet that allows milk to coagulate to make cheese. And 90% of the world's cheese is dependent on animal rennet that is GMO. And why, you might ask? So Europe doesn't allow GMOs, and we get all of this cheese from Europe. How is that possible? Well, the answer is simple. It's politics. Because it was developed more than 40 years ago. It was necessary to sustain the small artisan cheese producers around the world. Italy's a bit of an exception because they still have a lot of veal, and it's the veal linings, the stomach linings of the veal that actually provide the rennet for the Italian cheeses. But, you know, in Alsace, very few other places, though. Almost all the cheese in Europe is produced with GMO rennet. But it's such a small amount, and it was so critical. And it also was developed because there was a concern about the animal welfare of the veal. And so it's a really good example of how there are trade-offs in values. What's more important, that there be a tiny bit of GMO to save the artisan cheese producers and to improve animal welfare, or that you know, we have no GMOs? Different people will come to different conclusions, but I believe that GMOs are really about two issues. One is, do we stop its expansion and expansion into some areas, and under what criteria? And how do we bring more integrity to the food system? And if it were my call, I would focus on that last issue, that second issue, because I think integrity really matters. But I think that we sometimes put all of our energy and our enthusiasm into campaigns that are really more marginal than we think. But that's my opinion, and I welcome people that have different points of view. And what I'd like to do with this class is sort of present a framework for thinking about sustainability, and then allow participants to add their own values onto that framework, so they can make decisions based on their company's needs and their consumers' perceptions. But also, I will say, give them an opportunity to have information so that they can choose to inform their consumers. Because we don't just want to say, yes, consumer, you're right. I know that's sort of a marketing principle, but I think it's important when we're talking about changing a whole system to be responsible, that we have a responsibility as educators to really share information with our consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember I was in a store, and I can't remember where it was, but I saw signs that said, you know, gluten-free broccoli and gluten-free, you know, watermelon, and it really underscores exactly what you're talking about, the marketing message versus sort of the substance of the argument. So on that note, I'm going to ask about some metrics, and this is another question that came in advance. And the person asked, what are the KPIs, or the key performance indicators, that firms should use for reporting sustainability in order to make sure that they're actually using real metrics that have real meaning, substance, things like that?
I love that question, and that's been at the heart of so many conversations over the past 20 years. I saw a quote this week from Ceres, the folks, global organization that looks at integrity in business operations. And the quote was something, and forgive me for not being quite right on this, is that voluntary disclosure is like Swiss cheese. It's appealing, but it's full of holes. I think I actually got that. And so I think, you know, there's disclosure, and then there's internal metrics. And they're related, but they're not exactly the same. So I think the first question is, why are you reporting information? Why are you measuring things? I think you have to have a goal in mind. And if you use, and that really has to be based on your capability to set measurable targets, and then to measure those targets with integrity, and to really communicate your targets with your target audiences. I use target a couple of times, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So let me give you an example. Starbucks may have among the most sophisticated metrics system. And whether or not you like Starbucks, they pioneered a lot of the ways a lot of companies have followed them in looking at what they want to measure. They've been very, very clear about what they want to measure. And historically, meaning for the past 8 or 9 years or so, have been very clear about whether they hit a goal and whether they didn't hit a goal. And if they hit a goal earlier than the time frame that they hoped for, did they set a more ambitious goal? This is so company by company specific, because the capabilities are different. I mean, I'll give you the example of food service. I have to go back to food service. And this is true really of supermarkets too. Very low margin businesses. And so there's not a lot of capability within companies to have a full-time dedicated person sort of setting the targets and measuring the targets and communicating with all of the people who need to know. And so the real question, and not a lot of money to hire outside consultants either. So there are a number of outside organizations that share frameworks that can be used, but it's fundamentally all about the question, what do you want to measure? And what kind of change will that engender? Like what do you want to measure, and where are you going with that measurement? I mean, if your goal is to only buy, let's say, meat that's certified by a particular animal welfare organizations, well, that's a nice goal, but what are you changing? Are you working with a supplier to change her practices? Or are you just competing for a very limited number of certified farm products? And so again, I think this goes to the core of what we're talking about. If we're trying to build a sustainable food system, we have to talk about what those big goals are, and then what are the capabilities of the different companies represented around the table in this intensive. What can we do? Short-term, medium-term, long-term aspiration to actually contribute to meeting increasingly strong goals. Because if we set our targets too low, we're not going to be part of creating a sustainable food system. We may only contribute to better marketing of our own companies. Not that I have any strong feelings about
that. Thank you. I think that we're going to move then into an area that I think we probably have 2 or 3 questions about, and that is sort of what you see as the role of vegan and plant-based innovation as we move into this new food economy. We see a lot of marketing attention paid to that topic too, right? I mean, plant-based and plant proteins, and it is inspiring a whole lot of debate. So what do you think the impact of that movement is going to be on the food economy and sustainability?
Well, I'm going to make a distinction between vegan and plant-based and plant proteins. And I'm going to do that because I am skeptical that there really is anything called vegan. And that's going to be a little controversial, and I'll tell you why. Commercial fertilizers that are used on 98% of the crops in the United States and most of the world don't include any animal products. But many organic farms with diversified cropping systems and animals do rely on animal manure in order to create greater yields on those farms. Is that vegan food? Is organic food vegan food? Organic crops, fruits and vegetables. You know, when we mill grains, there are plenty of bugs that get caught up in milling. I mean, there are FDA limits for how much contamination from bugs, but vegans that I've had a lot of conversation with vegans over the past 5 years who neither want us to serve cane sugar nor honey because they consider them not vegan. And I think that there is a level of purity that the vegan movement is aspiring to that is unrealistic in our food system, even if you're growing your own. That said, I think that the desire to be more plant-based and to be closer to vegan and vegetarian is heartfelt. I think it's growing. I don't think it's going away. And I think what's fueling it even more than concern for the environment is concern for health. Whether real or misplaced, I think most of it is real, but I think it is increasing. And I think that there is greater power in communicating a message that plant food is good food if we have lined up the environmental arguments, the health arguments, and chefs, this is where we need you, the deliciousness arguments. If you don't have all three of them, you lose. And because each of them is a really small piece, but combined, it's like having, 2 + 2 = 20 instead of 6. So I do think that there is a lot of growth in this area. I think some companies have done a fabulous job. I think some of them are not so fabulous and are not going to last. But look, disruption happens in every industry. I mean, new companies have, all big companies were once small companies. And nobody starts out humongous. And so most of them don't make it, or they're bought up along the way. Some of them are going to make it, and some of them are really going to create delicious food. But I will tell you that the more we get back to unprocessed food and make a wide variety of vegetables really delicious, the more we're going to bring people in, and they're not going to notice that the portions of animal proteins are getting smaller and are not even necessary for some meals and in some cases.
Great, thank you. The next question that came in from our viewers I know is near and dear to your heart. So I will tell you, it's how do you prevent food waste and what do you do with the leftovers?
This is really near and dear to my heart because I have been working on the ideas and measuring food waste and working with, I actually have a small team of people who are chefs working with other chefs trying to prevent food waste. But let me make a distinction, okay? It is sometimes reported that 40% of the world's food goes to waste. I will tell you that I don't believe that number. And even if it's 20%, it's way too much. It's enough to feed the world. It is almost unmeasurable because what's waste in one calculation is food in another, whether we're talking about the food for the microbes in the soil or for animals on a farm or whatever it is. But I think the greatest tragedy is when food is grown, transported, warehoused, displayed for sale, prepared, and then not eaten, and then transported again to a landfill where it generates methane gas, which is 25 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So the biggest opportunity we have to reduce waste is really at the last stage, at that consumer stage. That isn't the province of procurement professionals. So I will say that what I would like to address in this intensive is how do we in the procurement ends of responsibility address this issue? And the way we do that is look at our supply chains and look at the opportunities we have to minimize waste. And there are really several different ways. Let me point to two. One is there historically has been certain cuts of meat cut to a particular size, where it used to be that the recommended portion of meat in many parts of the world was either 2 ounces or 60 grams, depending on what country you were in. And then it's inched up and it's inched up and it's inched up. And I have now seen on order forms where chefs can order fillets of fish that are 9 ounces. Nobody needs 9 ounces of fish unless you're feeding a family of 3 or 4 or 5 in some cases. And so I think how we portion things and how we decide what's small, medium, and large, what are those definitions? Why should we have major retailers, defining a size of soda or coffee as small, medium, and large? That's a role that we can play. And we can play that by editing the choices that chefs can buy and then serve. We can also look further back in our supply chains and say, what are the products that are going to waste? Okay, so my favorite recent example is coffee flour. So 50% of the biomass of coffee cherries that give us that delicious, jolt. I am very much in love with my coffee, but 50% of the biomass right now around the world, we're talking about billions of pounds of great stuff is being, left aside. It can't be used that much as fertilizer because it needs to be amended by other properties. Otherwise, it's too intensive for the soil. But it could be used for fertilizer in some cases. It could be used to amend gluten-free products. It could be used to amend, soup bases, brownies. I mean, there's so many lovely things you can do with coffee flour. My other favorite example is whey in cheese making, in yogurt making. There is a lot of protein left over. That in many cases is not used. In many cases it is, but in other ways, in many places it is not. So I think as supply chain managers, one of the most powerful things that we can do is talk with our suppliers and understand what isn't used in their supply chains, and then thinking about how we might be able to utilize that, because that food waste largely goes unreported, but it is often great material that is nutritious and would contribute to a sustainable food system. Supports smaller farmers as well.
Great, thank you so much. Our last question, actually second to last question, is a two-part question. So I will read it as written, and then you can pick either part of it or answer both. It's up to you. But this person asks, what is the future of local food movements? And they report that they see a lot of tech startups kind of mushrooming. And they want to know if these tech startups in sort of the sustainable marketplace can actually achieve scale.
I would love to know that too, because I will tell you that as a supply chain manager, I often give an opportunity for new startups to have an opportunity in my supply chain. And we've seen a number of them fail, and it's very disruptive within a contract catering situation to have that occur. I'm going to go back to the statement I said before, which is that, you know, every big company today started as a little company, and they have grown for in many different ways, but companies fail in their march to become more stable, whether that means getting bigger or other capabilities or react to consumer interest changes. And I would say that many of the startups today most of them are going to fail. I am looking at some, and I'm hopeful that they will scale. But you know what? I'm not a venture capitalist. I'm a supply chain manager. So I look at capability to be able to serve the needs of my chefs over, you know, a year or 2 years. But it's not surprising, really. We shouldn't be surprised when small and new companies fail, because they're contributing new ideas and it's hard to get traction. I mean, change management's really hard. And that kind of goes to the issue of small farms too, and local food movement. I mean, local food means different things in different parts of the United States and different parts of the world. And that means, you know, the distance. Local food in Australia, let me give you a sense, is like saying local food on the west coast of the United States. I mean, the line, the mileage is huge, absolutely huge. And so it's going to mean different things to different people. I think if you were, let's say you're running you're a client, if you will. No, that's my perspective, but you are running a food program at a university, and you're in the middle of, and you're a rural area, anywhere in the world. The local food movement is really going to be about how do you support your community more than reducing food miles, which is now well shown to be not the most important thing in thinking about the food system's contribution to climate change. So I think there is a role for the local food movement. I really think that there's a role both in innovation of flavor and really try things on a smaller scale and gain acceptance and try things out. I also think that in maintaining, you know, a fabric of communities, very, very important. But then there are a lot of areas of the world that are well served by medium-sized, I mean, you can define that many ways, or larger food businesses that are doing great, great jobs. And it's going to be uneven, but that's okay, as long as the criteria for considering what is responsible growing practices, both from an environmental management standpoint and frankly from the responsibility from a labor standpoint, I think is really, really critical. But we live in such a dynamic world that I think we have to be creative and we have to be place-based. We have to think about what's needed in particular areas and be flexible and also be always asking questions. And I'll leave it there because I think that, you know, for me, sustainability is really all about asking questions. Don't just assume what you read on the internet or what a certification paper says. You have to engage with suppliers or you're not going to be able to affect change and you're not going to learn about change, whether a supplier is small, local, large, medium, wherever it is.
Thank you, Helene. The time's gone so quickly, I can't believe it's already 10 to the hour, so I want to leave plenty of time for Kathy to talk about the upcoming course and some of the programs. Just to sort of give you the last word, if you could just remind people of sort of why you're excited to teach this course and why they should sign up, I think that would be a great way to end our conversation.
I think the most important thing is that this is a conversation, and the conversation has mushroomed over the past 10 years. And what I would like to do in this in-person intensive is give people tools to ask better questions and to really forward the conversation in a way where we are all more sure about what we're seeking, what we want to measure, how to measure it, and then to be able to reflect on whether or not we've been successful and how we need to proceed from there. Thanks for letting me have the last word.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I'm now pleased to introduce Kathy Joran. She's the director of the Food Business School. And Kathy will tell us about the course and some upcoming exciting news about FBS in general.
Thanks so much for joining us on FoodBiz Plus today. And thanks so much to Helene for talking about the upcoming Sustainable Supply Chains program and just answering questions from industry leaders about what is sustainable supply chain and how to implement that. If you all are interested in learning more, as Helene mentioned, her class is coming up on October 30 to November 1st here in Napa Valley at our CIA at Copia campus. We'd love to have you join us. Please see the information about the course on our website at foodbusinessschool.org. Also, I'd like to mention our upcoming Concept to Shelf course. If any of you are developing a food product concept and would like to learn how to bring it to market, Chris Cornyn from Before Brands will be teaching that course on October 27th and 28th, also here in Napa. And you can find out more about that also on the website. So we would look forward to having you join us for either of those. In addition, we have an online course running this fall, beginning October 9th for 6 weeks on ethical leadership, which actually addresses sustainable supply chains when you think about leadership and decision-making related to your business, as well as other topics related to food businesses and things that take place in business where you need to make a decision and you want to be a leader with ethical values in mind. So please take a look at that. That's online. It's asynchronous. You can do the work at your own time each week, being taught by Bob Johnson, who is one of the professors at the CIA. So please take a look at all of these. Let us know if you have any questions. We would look forward to welcoming you to any of these programs. And also, both the Concept to Shelf course and the Ethical Leadership course have seminars just like this one, free webinars coming up with those faculty members. You can see those on the website, and you can see them here as well. This Friday is Chris Cornyn talking about Concept to Shelf and food innovation. And then next Wednesday, the 20th, will be Bob Johnson talking about ethical leadership. So please join us for any and all of those, and we look forward to seeing you at the Food Business School. Thanks so much for joining today. Have a great day.